Hi, hello. Okay, quick disclaimer before this video begins. This is an interview that I conducted for one of my classes in college. Uh, I apologize ahead of time for the quality of video. It was recorded over Zoom, and thank you for watching. Hey, should be all good.
Hey,
Right, so hello to everyone watching this interview. My name is Sarah Aparicio. I'm here with Mark Darrah. Mark was a veteran of the video game studio BioWare, and he worked there from around 1997 up until his retirement in early 2021. BioWare is most known for its role-playing games Mass Effect and Dragon Age, both of which are critically acclaimed and have been nominated and won multiple awards. Mark Darrah worked mainly on the Dragon Age franchise, specifically as the director and executive producer on Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age 2, and Dragon Age Inquisition. Many have debated the role of video games in our society, many seeing them as violent distractions, while others see them as a gateway into a world unlike our own, giving players a chance to experience a beautiful piece of media in a unique and entertaining way. How are you today, Mark?
I'm doing well.
Great, great. So let's get right into it. We'll start first with the nitty gritty. The main sort of point of this interview is mostly focused on the role art and video games have. So to start things off simply, do you believe that video games are a piece of art and the people who make them artists?
Yeah, I do believe that video games are an art form. The video games have an interesting place in history right now because I would say that we are simultaneously making art and toasters, which makes the media criticism of them quite difficult. When you are writing a review of a movie, you're not talking about whether or not the projector worked or the seats fell apart. Whereas with video games, you are talking about that often because the technology is still evolving and changing. So that results in the criticism being bifurcated, and you have some reviews that are written from the perspective of this is a very good toaster, and some reviews that are written from this is a very good piece of art, and most are written as a combination of the two.
Wonderful. Yeah. Now focusing a little more on sort of your time as a, creative person in BioWare, BioWare itself was founded around 1995 and you later joined in 1997. And then around 2008, BioWare was bought by EA and is now one of the many studios that they own. And, during I guess each era that you were a part of, pre-EA and post-EA, did you ever notice, changes in the way that you would make things or your workflow and, the way your creativity essentially worked?
Do you mean from the perspective of the different ownership forms?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. Definitely, EA, as most public companies, are reluctant to spend money to various degrees, because the more money they spend, the worse it makes their profitability look. So one of the reasons that BioWare ended up being bought in the first place was because we had basically run out of money. And we run out of money in the pursuit of quality, to ahead of everything. But the problem with that being your strategy is if quality is ahead of everything, you are probably going out of business.
Mm-hmm.
On the flip side, in a big public company, you have the opposite problem often arising where it is about profitability ahead of everything, and that results in more constraints on people, and also more pressure to do more profitable features that might not be quality features. Microtransactions and other monetization models that have arisen more recently sometimes are attempted to be rationalized as for the player, but they're really money-making features. So if you're putting quality first, you're probably not putting those kinds of features in. If you're putting money first, you probably are.
Yeah. And did you guys find yourself following a lot of the common trends in RPG games at the time? The horse mounts, big open worlds, all that sort of stuff.
So definitely Dragon Age Inquisition is that way. It has both of those features. Horses exist in Dragon Age Inquisition entirely because at the time a fantasy RPG needed to have horses. It's a what I call a table stakes feature, meaning you need to have that feature just to be at the table. Otherwise, people aren't going to take you seriously. The feature isn't actually that important to most players, so the feature needs to exist at an adequate level of quality. Open world was similarly at the same time a table stakes feature. Unfortunately, open world is, you don't get to do open world as a C and get away with it, which you can with mounts. You have to do it as at least a B or an A feature in order for it to be good enough for the player. So horses, I think, a good example of that kind of feature that you do just because you have to. Open world, unfortunately, takes over your entire game and modifies the structure of the game as a whole.
Yeah. So while you were working at BioWare, obviously you're not working alone. You're working in a big studio with dozens of other people. What was, the collaboration between different groups like, and did you notice any changes as the studio grew over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that actually collaboration got better over time as culture matured, but also as structure and systems matured. So Baldur's Gate 1, which is the first game I worked on in 1997, I think had a team of around 65. It's actually pretty easy to have collaboration at that size because you basically know everyone and interact with everyone on a fairly regular basis. Dragon Age Inquisition, the team, when you count in outsourcers, well above 400. That's a much different thing. You can't interact with everyone on the team. That being said, I think that in the early days, the disciplines of design and art were considered as very separate things that didn't really need to interact with each other very much, almost like you would slide a request through a little slot and then get something back. Whereas when I was leaving BioWare, that had really changed, and teams of designers and artists worked together collaboratively much more in order to build a better experience. And you see it in the games. The games now have levels that make more sense for the gameplay, as opposed to often back in the 90s. The levels were either built by the designers and kind of ugly, or they were built by artists and didn't necessarily serve any gameplay purpose.
So this sort of leads into a few questions I had in regards to some of the videos that you've made, because I haven't had the chance to watch every single video you've made on your YouTube channel, but I have seen a couple of them. Specifically, there's two videos I'll end up pointing out, but the first one is related to your video, Dragon Age Inquisition Memories and Lessons. So you bring up this point where you say sometimes people are never getting on board, and from those people, unfortunately, what you get is a statement that sounds a lot like, I don't know what the vision is. In later stages, when someone says, I don't know what the vision is, what they're actually saying is, I don't like the vision and I'm going to be confused by it because I don't want it to work. And you then continue to talk about working with those individuals and, thinking about their place in the development team. And, like you had said, you had worked with eventually much larger teams. Confusion is almost expected in these situations. And do you think, this is really just a product of, the sheer size of the team? And was this confusion ever present in much smaller teams, or, did people sort of get kind of walked over, just, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly confusion is a factor of larger teams because the distance between, because vision communication can't happen entirely from the top. So if I'm in charge of a project and there are 600 people, I can push vision to 600 people. That's fine. But that's not really how you get people there. That's just part of it. The rest of it has to come from lower levels of management. If in a really small team, I'm interacting with you every single day. So yeah, I can get you there on my own. On a 600-person team, your leads lead, they all need to be on board as well. And if I'm over here talking about working on combat design, and you're over here designing the first conversation in the game, my understanding of what you're working on is very distant. Mm-hmm. So certainly it's part of it. The other thing I think as well is the people who aren't on board, who are acting like they're confused but not really confused. That also, I think, is to some degree a product of team size, because on a smaller team, the dissenters are they can't really hide in the structure as much. They can't pretend to be confused, because we literally just spent 3 hours together talking about this. So you're either stupid, or you're dissenting, and so that dissension is more obvious, and you can typically do stuff with it. Whereas I can only spend so long. If you're dissenting off and you're a junior level designer, I can only spend so much time trying to bear it out and deal with that dissension. So it's much easier for you to act confused and pretend to be confused when you're in fact not in a larger team. There's just more places to hide.
Right. Yeah. Was this, an issue that you encountered much later in your time at BioWare, or did you just see this happening, regardless of where you were at?
I would say, yeah, it is a product of the later, when the teams were larger, more. I do think it was present on projects like Neverwinter and Jade Empire, so those were still pretty small teams, because those were games that were, it's hard to argue with Neverwinter that it was a departure of what had come before, because there hadn't been a lot before, but it was. Jade Empire was certainly a departure. So that did happen. But like I said, I think that when it was dissension as opposed to confusion, like Jade Empire had lots of confusion, that legitimate confusion. But the dissension, which did exist, was a lot more obvious and in the forefront, as opposed to being disguised as something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always something that's kind of interesting to me, especially with these really large teams. That communication is critical to the success of any project. And another thing that I've always sort of wondered about that sort of line of communication from the top to the bottom is specifically, Dragon Age Origins was supposed to be originally a standalone game, kind of existed on its own in a contained world. So, what was the sort of process that went to it, becoming a series now, with Dragon Age Dreadwolf, on the rise and coming out, and was that decision influenced by the other BioWare games that had really successful, sequels and trilogies, like Mass Effect, for example?
I think more than anything, by the time that BioWare was bought by EA, EA wasn't buying not a franchise. Mm-hmm. So you're right. Dragon Age Origins was envisioned as a standalone game. There's lots of weird little bits of lore in there still that are kind of time bombs that we've largely moved beyond and patched over, but still lots of weird things that aren't fully taken into account. So it's really more. It should never have been a standalone game. I think, it's not that you necessarily need to approach a franchise the way the Mass Effect trilogy did, which is, we're going to make this. In fact, I think there are some major problems in approaching a franchise the way the Mass Effect did, because the Mass Effect trilogy effectively ends up being a single game, a single very giant game that, as a result, much like the Hobbit movies, the third one has problems caused by the previous ones and isn't able to stand on its own completely. But Dragon Age should have always been envisioned as a franchise of some sort, as opposed to retrofitted into being one. So it was a mistake from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've definitely seen it happen, when I've convinced some of my friends to go and play Dragon Age. A lot of them actually had started with Inquisition and had known nothing about the previous two games. So it's interesting seeing that sort of play out now. Mm-hmm. In retrospect. I have another question relating to another video you made, sort of on the topic of the overall quality of something you make. In a video that you had made, I think it was posted a few days ago, Get Better by Actually Finishing. You made this analogy about pottery, and you also tell the story of that one professor you had who, you would make 50 pots for a grade versus one singular pot, and you compared it to sort of how game development works. And your advice was to always just make more pots, to keep creating, regardless of how many pots you make. Isn't the worst thing you make somehow going to define you as an artist? And do you think this philosophy can bring someone into the mindset that, quantity is better than quality?
I think that in almost all cases, most people inherently are going to obsess over quality. So by adopting the mindset of finishing more things, you are balancing out that natural inclination to overcommit to quality. And what usually happens, like I said in the video, is that if you spend all of your time making one level, that level is going to be the best version of that level that you could make given no input from any other things. If you make 40 levels, that level is probably going to be, that first level is probably going to be better because you're going to understand the process better. You're going to understand what works and doesn't work. But even if it isn't, you've made 40 levels, delete that level. You don't have to necessarily keep all your pots. You can at the end decide that okay, yeah, I made 40 levels. 10 of these are bad. Even half of them are terrible. And delete half of them, and you still have way more than you would have if you spent all your time on just a few.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a quality that comes from the act of pushing things through. And really, I know I'm being very extreme in that video and saying just finish more things, don't stop, don't look back, just go, go, go. And I do think there's power in that, but even not doing that, even just approaching things with the belief of moving forward. So spend as long as you want on this phase, but then move forward and go to the next phase and always take a step forward. Even that is going to get you getting things more done. The video game industry is littered with games, some of which you've heard of and some of which you've never heard of, that just get stuck iterating in the middle. They take so long that they have to upgrade their graphic engine, and then they take so long they have to upgrade the graphic engine again, and then it takes 15 years, and then it just never comes out. Yeah. So it's got to ship eventually.
Yeah, this is definitely becoming a more present thing in the gaming industry, especially where people want to put out like the absolute best version possible, but you're leaving these super long development cycles. We're seeing this with, the Elder Scrolls franchise especially. Skyrim has been re-released how many times now, and still no news on the next game in that franchise. And this leads into another question I had regarding the ever-growing complexity of technology, and games are taking much longer to be made, and we're seeing this with Dreadwolf, which has been started and restarted multiple times over the past 8 years. And is this a problem that's unique to BioWare, or is this something that has just been in the gaming industry, since it sort of became an industry? Games get restarted, ideas get scrapped, that sort of thing.
Dreadwolf had some particular things involved, some of which are externalities coming from EA. But yeah, video game development, its complexity has been going up exponentially. Like I said, Baldur's Gate 1, a AAA game of its era, probably 65 people, made in like 2 years. Games these days, and not just BioWare, 5 years is probably a good average for games coming out now. That was not the case even 5-6 years ago. Like, things have gotten incredibly expensive and much slower. Partially it's because to some degree genres are converging. So where before you could get away with your action adventure game having 10,000 words of dialogue and no level ups and no equipment. Now you're calling it an action adventure game, but it's an RPG with really good action. Or your RPG now needs to have really good action. And so everything is kind of getting converged. So all of the bits of all of the genres are being pulled together. And every time you add a new feature node, it's not just adding the cost of that feature, it's also adding the cost of integrating that feature into everything else.
Right. of course, every game has its issues when being made, and we see this especially near sort of the end of your time at BioWare, with games like Andromeda and Mass Effect, or Mass Effect Andromeda and Dragon Age Inquisition and Anthem. But specifically, the Frostbite engine, making that transition from BioWare's own in-house engine to Frostbite. And it was always a bit confusing to me because, a lot of game studios have their own engine, or they stick to one specific engine. But Mass Effect was made with Unreal. Dragon Age was made with BioWare's own in-house engine up until Inquisition, which made that switch to Frostbite. You know was there ever a point where Dragon Age Inquisition was going to be on its own in-house BioWare engine, or was it always sort of going to be on Frostbite? And
Inquisition was always going to be on
okay.
something. And at the time, the political climate was such that the options were keep trying to make it with Aurora, or with Eclipse, which was not practical, or Frostbite. There just wasn't an appetite for anything other than that. Yeah.
And making that transition into the new engine, I have done my own research into the whole situation surrounding that transition and how you had to essentially build everything from the ground up because Frostbite wasn't intended for RPGs. It was made for more action first-person shooter games. So what challenge and limitations did you face with your team while trying to make that transition?
So I would say that Inquisition is of the three games is the one that approached Frostbite correctly, and then was followed by two games that didn't. But you need to respect what the engine is. So if you look at Mass Effect 1, which switched to Unreal, it made the mistake of trying to force Unreal to be Eclipse. And that was a mistake, and the engine is constantly fighting back at you. So anytime you go to a new engine, you're probably going to have to recreate most things. Unreal, which is an engine that has been used to ship hundreds and hundreds of games, is basically still a shooter engine.
Right.
You are building everything on top of that for the most part. It's a bit more sympathetic to the plight of the developer and understanding that you are going to have to do a lot of these things, where Frostbite is a stripped down, souped up graphic engine that is reluctant to let you do anything else because it's designed around being the fastest possible graphic engine for a shooter as it can be. But fundamentally, I'm a strong believer that the best engine to use is the engine you just used, because you understand it. When that's not possible, you can work with any engine. I know that Frostbite is scapegoated and blamed for a lot of BioWare's woes, and on Andromeda and Anthem, there's some truth to that. And I don't know that Dragon Age Inquisition built on Unreal isn't a radically better or different game.
Right. So bit of a change in pace as we're nearing sort of the end of my list of questions. So if you could go back to any BioWare project, regardless on if you had worked on it or not, which would it be? Would you change anything, and why specifically that project?
So rev up the time machine. Honestly, the biggest change I would probably make would be to. So for a game that I've worked on, I would be so easy. If I only have 5 minutes, would be to do a couple of changes to hinterlands for Inquisition. That's sort of like I can pop in for a couple of days. Bigger than that, I think there are some ways to shave some of the worst of the rough edges off of Dragon Age 2, like in maybe even keeping it on its timeline, just with a sort of knowledge of the criticisms. Maybe you can not get rid of the picnic spot from the caves, and maybe even lampshade the caves with Varric's dialogue. Maybe don't make you have to fight Orsino. And then I don't know that you fix Anthem's launch with a time machine. I think there's more required than that. So
So next one also does have to do a bit with Anthem and Andromeda. You know, they were some of the last games that you had worked on at BioWare, and obviously the public reception surrounding those games was quite messy. And of course, some of it's due to internal issues and some of it is due to expectations of the fans. Why exactly do you think these games failed to reach, you know, either your expectations or the fans' expectations? And do you kind of wish there was anything you had done differently during that process at any time?
I was really a gun for hire on Andromeda. Andromeda is at least partially a victim of circumstance. So it came out with a few bugs that actually it didn't need to, but that it had fixed. It just didn't make it into the build. And then it landed on top of Zelda and Horizon Zero Dawn at the same time. So it came out into a very a climate that was really paying attention and very critical, and justifiably picked apart the mistakes that were made. There was a decision made on Andromeda to change its tone, so it's a lighter tone, a younger tone than the. So one way to look at it is the Mass Effect trilogy is essentially it's a Gen X protagonist. It's the protagonist is the protagonist from the action movies from in the 80s, whereas the protagonist in Andromeda is more like a protagonist from the action movies in the 2000s. And so that change is controversial, and I think largely Andromeda has moved past that controversy. But at launch, a lot of the pushback, there was the pushback about, you know, my face is tired and bad textures and stuff like that. But a lot of the pushback was actually pushing back against that tone change. I think you have to be willing to do that sort of thing, because otherwise you're just making a game for an ever older audience. So I was against it at the time. I think Andromeda probably made the right decision. It's just unfortunate that it gets lumped in with a bunch of other problems. I'm not convinced that BioWare should have been making Anthem. It was conceived by Casey as something very different than what launched, and some sort of multiplayer storytelling. I don't believe that those problems were actually truly solved. He left in 2014. Whatever he was imagining wasn't communicated to the team clearly enough for them to execute on his vision. So at that point, it was a game that was basically Destiny, but it was envisioned before Destiny existed.
Right.
So, but at that point in 2014, now they're basically making Destiny, but they're not really acknowledging that they're making Destiny. So Anthem is arguably flawed in its DNA. It's got some great bits, but I'm not sure how you make Anthem be. I guess I'm maybe looking at it through the wrong lens. There's an Anthem that stands toe to toe with Destiny, but it's still a high 70s, low 80s Metacritic game. My career was largely about, you know, making the game that is capable of winning Game of the Year. Anthem, in its very conception, or at least in its post-2014 world, probably wasn't capable of that. But Call of Duty is never winning Game of the Year. Never in a billion years will Call of Duty win will win Game of Year. But I don't think those teams care. They're very happy with being culturally impactful and making tons of money. So maybe there's a version of Anthem that's like that, which is It's big and successful, and yeah, maybe that means it's low 80s, high 70s Metacritic, But you sold 15 million copies, so how sad can you be?
Right. So we're reaching sort of the end of this interview. I have about 2 questions left. So second to last one. The concept of Dragon Age itself is just like, it's so incredibly fascinating to me. You have this unique world, and development started way back in 2002, I believe.
Yeah, that's probably right. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, a million different things go into making a video game, especially, it's made during this time where technology is changing really quickly. And sort of how did the transfer of ideas happen between, those who are writing dialogue to, the composition of the soundtrack to the world building and the gameplay. And then, from when the game was released, it was met with massive success, obviously. And then you had the DLC and the extra books that were released. How did that all just happen?
So Dragon Age Origins very much originally conceived of being a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the way that combat was envisioned of working was going through that lens. So it is a game that is a lot of different parts developed, I would say, unfortunately, independently, basically being glued together into something. Sometimes that works, and sometimes that doesn't work, and sometimes you get, like, Origins has problems where, like, the Darkspawn faction doesn't have very good visual coherency. It doesn't make sense as being a bunch of different things caused by the same source,
right?
Because of the way that it was developed. It has an art direction that it's basically like lumpy Tudor houses. Like it has a lot of flaws because of the way that it was developed. Since Origins, I think there's been a lot more care taken towards the IP and towards making sure that it's at least it has rules. It doesn't violate those rules, or if it does violate those rules, it violates those rules on purpose, as opposed to just accidentally introducing Nightcrawler teleporting around all over the place. Like, it does something. It either tries to make its teleportation make sense, or it doesn't do teleportation. Like, as an example, it's got some really strong core ideas around the IP, around it's characters first. It's even though it maybe hasn't always said that out loud, but it's characters first. It's about people. Power comes at a cost. Everyone thinks they're the hero of their own story. That basically, like, those sorts of things, that's what informs most of the development more than anything. You should, in most cases, be able to look at the villain of the game and go, "Oh yeah, I kind of get what they're going for." And in fact, Origins is arguably, depends on who you. I mean, if Loghain is the villain, then that's completely true. If the Archdemon is the villain, then no, that the Archdemon is more like an elemental force. But in all the other games, yeah, you're looking at the villain and you're like, yeah, I get it. I might even agree with you, but I'm not going to let you destroy the world because of the thing you believe.
Yeah, I think that's sort of one of the incredible things about video games is that, they tell these incredible stories and they take you, through these stories. And it's especially one of the things that I love about BioWare games is that they really just take you through the story and you feel all the emotions behind each character and behind each story beat. And I think it's a really rare thing to see in a lot of different kinds of media, not just video games, but in movies and TV. You don't always see these wonderful dynamics between the characters and their world. And for my final question, so how does it feel knowing that something you made has impacted the lives of so many? And do you ever see yourself, returning to the video game industry for one more game or as sort of an advisor?
So I do consulting now, so I'm not completely out. In terms of another big game with my name on it. I can't really imagine myself leading a big AAA team. Maybe in a world as the next 10 years is probably going to be interesting for structure in video games. We might come out the other side and be a lot more like movies, where teams are more ephemeral, more products of a single game. If the structure is established in such a way to support that, that could be an interesting leadership challenge. But these just big, giant monoliths that we have right now, it's hard and exhausting to lead those teams. I can't imagine myself doing that in its current form.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It was absolute pleasure speaking with you. Again, I apologize for the confusion about, scheduling times. But it's still absolutely wonderful to talk to you. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me.
Absolutely. Thank you for meeting with me.
Have a wonderful day.
Okay, you too.